And without further ado, I'm Scott Alexander of Astral Codex 10. This is a man who needs no introduction, Nate Silver. We are extremely grateful to have him here today. My plan is I'm going to ask him a couple questions, then I will open up the floor to any of you who want to ask questions. Do we have an audience mic?
Yes.
Great. Then let's go. So Nate, there are about 200 people here today. It's our most crowded session. None of these people care about either of us at all. None of our triumphs, none of our setbacks. They all want to know who is going to win the election.
I think we're past the point now where you can honestly call it a toss-up. I think if you had a free wager to place on any of the many prediction market sites, then I think you'd probably at 50-50 want to bet Trump. Maybe not much more than 50-50. But so it's a kind of classic case of having a prior versus posterior, the prior being that like usually elected incumbents win re-election. The economy is good depending on how you measure it. Not good without some speed bumps. I mean, obviously prices are a big concern for voters, but if you knew nothing else, if there had been no polls, your prior would be that Biden would win at 70% likelihood. We are into June now. Trump has had a very consistent lead in polls in swing states of 2 or 3 points. I think we're at the point where the balance tips a little bit toward that polling data point. Probably when we have the 538 model, the Silver Bulletin model launching in a few weeks, right? I haven't run the numbers yet. My hunch is that it will say 55 or 60% Trump or something like that, right? Now, I've been wrong before about kind of what my model says. We have a complex version of an economic calculation. I don't know what that will say either. And there's been some movement in the polls toward Biden since Trump's conviction. But I think it's a little bit dishonest to just say it's a way to like cover your ass and not, you guys understand 55% doesn't mean 99%. The rest of the world might not. This might get aggregated and thrown on Twitter. But that's my honest assessment is like, I think at this point, Trump is a very, very slight favorite.
Thank you. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I wanted to ask you, I think one of the grievances of this community is that the media is not made of forecasters. The media is made of idiots who don't deserve to have opinions expressing those opinions anyway. And then you have all of these super forecasters and prediction markets and so on that aren't being taken seriously. You are the one exception to this. You are a great forecaster who has managed to become kind of worldwide known as a great forecaster and have people consult you on their opinions. So my question is, let's say there is a almost Nate Silver quality forecaster in the audience, wondering how to become Nate Silver levels of famous. What's that pathway, or what's your origin story for how you succeeded where nobody else has done this?
I mean, my origin story involved kind of being in the right place at the right time, but it was also very circuitous where, I took a consulting job out of college. I was a transfer pricing consultant for KPMG, which is just as exciting as it sounds. In 2003 or 4, I guess, 2003, I kind of discovered the then nascent world of online poker. This was in the middle of what's now known as the poker boom, where poker was on ESPN a lot. An amateur accountant named Chris Moneymaker, great poker name, won the World Series of Poker main event and touched off really, really juicy soft poker games that I kind of played after coming home from work and then going to the bar and then coming home at 10 at night. And the games were so juicy that I could still make a lot of money anyway for a couple of years. So quit my consulting job to play poker and work on baseball forecasting for the group Baseball Prospectus, which is still around, fortunately. And then in 2006, Congress passed a law that basically banned internet poker. Technically not, but de facto. That got me more interested in politics. I wanted to see the assholes who put me out of my livelihood vote out of office, which a lot of them were, actually. And that kind of, with more time on my hands, I was frustrated with political coverage and kind of tried to apply the way we used analytics in baseball toward politics was the rough idea and founded 538. And then, 538 was the beginning of an inflection point in much more interest in politics with Barack Obama. And then you had Donald Trump come along. It's 8 years later, right? But it's been an interesting time. But look, I think people kind of wanted like a real life sequel to Moneyball or something, and so you kind of fit this like cultural need and then become like kind of popular for the wrong reasons, I think, in some ways. So like that's kind of like, I'm not sure I would necessarily advise. I mean, it's good in some ways, right? It's led to like financial well-being and recognition and things like that. But like I think like I still am kind of fighting in some ways like being well known for the wrong reasons. Because people think I'm some magic oracle and not someone who is more about uncertainty. I think people thought I was some type of partisan Democrat because in 2008 and 2012 we had, Obama with more chance of winning the consensus. So it's, it's been I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't not have taken that path, but like it was A, kind of random, and B, maybe not very generalizable.
Okay.
So what I would say is, look, differentiate yourself, especially kind of in an AI-driven world where we can talk about this more. I think kind of the average or baseline is more likely to rise. Like, don't be afraid. I mean, this is the one conference where this might be dangerous to say, like, oh, just be yourself. Usually it's good advice for people, maybe not in this conference. But don't be afraid to differentiate. Don't be afraid to be a little bit polarizing, to add something kind of unique to the world. Don't be afraid to specialize too much. Those are things that and don't worry too much about the haters. I mean, those are things that I think are relatively robust pieces of advice.
Okay. I'm bored of the human interest questions. I want to ask you your probabilities of various things.
Oh, shit. Okay.
Okay, let's start, and feel free to pass or give explanations. Probability that Democrats keep the Senate next election.
25%?
Okay. Probability that AI destroys the world before 2100.
So in the book, there's actually a range. Like a lot of people, I duck this question by giving a range, in part because I think there are very different definitions of what P-Doom means, from like the Eliezer, like literally every human, cat, and mouse is eradicated from the earth, to like that we kind of lose agency. That's kind of the maybe more loose definition. The range given in the book is kind of punting on being pinned down. It's 2% to 20%, which I see as reflecting the consensus. I mean, the expert surveys tend to be in the range of 5 to 10%, so I just kind of take that and expand the range outward further. Despite spending a ton of time talking to dozens of people in the expert community for the book, I couldn't quite converge on an opinion. It's a little bit weird. I guess I find kind of compelling cases both in the doomer and anti-doomer cases. I will say that when I was going from the first draft of the book to the second draft, I pared down the top end of that range. It was originally 2 to 25%, and now it's 2 to 20%, which is still a ridiculously large range. I do think it's somewhat material that GPT-4 came out, I guess, March 2023. I think there's been, I'm maybe in the wrong room to say this, I think there's been like a little bit of a plateau. I think if you had asked people in March 2023, what would you expect to have seen in LLMs by June 2024, I think we'd actually be a little bit under what we've seen in that development. And I think we're kind of at like an inflection point where that might be material. But look, in any other room, I'd be saying, yes, you have to take this risk seriously. Even toward the lower end, the expected value loss could be very high. Also, the upside could be very high. And the fact that Transformers have done miraculous things that were far beyond people's expectations. We have this like kind of machine that is almost human-like in its ability to do verbal reasoning. I mean, that's a very impressive development. But yeah, that's maybe it's an unsatisfactory answer. But that's kind of the short-ish version.
No, it's a good answer. I'm just trying to figure out whether I should take the geometric mean of that range or the arithmetic mean. Probability that in 15 years the United States is significantly more authoritarian. I know significantly is a weasel word. Answer however you prefer.
20%? I mean, look, are we talking about a kind of tail risk from Trump being elected or some other Trump-like figure? Or
I mean, that's one way it could happen. I'm kind of asking for your overall probability.
25% maybe. Yeah, maybe, maybe kind of 10% from some Trump adjacent scenario and 10% from some AI adjacent scenario. Well, how recently are we talking about, or how far in the future?
I said 15 years.
Yeah, and then maybe 5% from like left-wing authority, something like that. 25% seems not crazy.
Okay. And you've written a little bit about this. Do you have any other opinions on how we could prevent it or what we should be doing?
I mean, look, I am a big believer in liberal values, liberal as opposed to left necessarily. I think kind of continuing to kind of preach the gospel of free speech and well-regulated but free-ish markets. I think all that stuff is still pretty important. I don't know. Although I've become less confident, right? I mean, I'm still someone who kind of rings the bell for, hey, if you have better information out there and people are kind of rational in the long run, maybe this argument's getting a little bit harder to make, I suppose. But no, look, if I had like some genius solution, like how do we kind of prevent authoritarianism, then believe me, I'd be writing about it, and I'm not sure that I do, and maybe I'm just being stubborn by kind of like doubling down on my political priors and saying, yes, just kind of classical liberalism mixed with a generous welfare state those are kind of classic center-left liberal positions, and maybe those aren't working. I don't know, right? And maybe I haven't thought enough about this.
Probability that in 15 years it's a cliche that minorities obviously vote Republican.
I 20%. I mean, look, the black vote is still going to likely be 82 or 85 or 87% Democratic. I mean, the Hispanic vote might be more 50-50. I mean, I think the Asian American vote might be 70-30. You can get in definitions of like what counts as a minority group and not, and that gets complicated. Look, I think you see some reversion to the mean where Democrats are becoming the party of the college-educated class. And there are racial differences in kind of who has college degrees. It's a lot of white people. It's a lot of Asian people. It's fewer black and Hispanics, although Hispanic college attendance rates are increasing quite a bit. But like if you have some big regression analysis, then race still plays a fairly major role, I think. I do think the Republican Party, lacks visionary leaders, I suppose I'd say. I mean, maybe Trump has a certain type of political talent, but Trump is not very popular. I think the reason he's winning is because, Biden probably shouldn't be running again at 81 years old, and inflation has caused a lot of problems for incumbents all around the world, including in France and the UK, which are going to have elections next month. Even India, which did not have much inflation, Modi way underperformed what polls said, although did get reelected. So yeah, it's, if you kind of were able to get rid of the Trumpian element of the GOP, and then they could probably make a pretty good argument, but like they still are going to nominate a lot of bad candidates. There is still obviously, I think, a fair degree of racism in the United States. I think that's still more concentrated in the GOP. So I think those are some barriers on their upside.
Probability that the Democrats win the presidency this election conditional on Biden dropping dead tomorrow of natural causes.
Well, I'm trying to figure out if they nominate Harris or have an open process. I don't want to get aggregated in too many headlines. I think 50-50. And given that it was below 50 before, then I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, probability, if Joe Biden had retired a year ago, or not retired, but said, I'm not going to run for a second term, and we're going to have an open contest where you have the optionality of seeing how people perform, then I think Democrats would be favored, right? But no matter what they do now is pretty suboptimal. And by the way, if he had a more popular vice president, I think Biden might not have run for a second term. That's not based on any inside info. The White House probably hates my guts at this point. But I think that's a big problem here too, which is that the kind of natural succession that he made a lot of pretty implicit, almost virtually unexplicit promises in 2020 that like I'm running as a bridge to the next generation of Democrats, right? So it's not just that like he's old, it's also that the rationale for his campaign in 2020, it's an emergency situation. Trump is screwing up on COVID and other things. We need an elder statesman to come and right the ship till we get it back to port. And now we're at port and we're kind of in a peacetime situation and he's still running again. I mean, I think that's, if he doesn't beat Trump, it's going to come down as one of the biggest mistakes in American political history, right?
Probability that in 15 years, prediction markets will be as familiar a feature of the media landscape as polls or infographics or any of the other familiar features.
20%?
Really? Tell me more.
And I should disclose here, I am going to begin a kind of advisory role to prediction markets company soon. We're not ready to announce that quite yet, but that's full disclosure, right? Because I think it's I don't know. I mean, the obvious analogy in some ways is to sports betting, which has gotten very ubiquitous. I'm not sure that the kind of average kind of consumer of political news, as opposed to other categories, including sports for that matter, is necessarily all that quantitatively minded. I think they mostly want to be reaffirmed in their beliefs. I know it's kind of a cliche, but I think it's a true cliche for the most part. I think there's in some ways more, I mean, it's partly the last panel if you saw it. It's kind of like, I think in some ways the rationales are more interesting than the number. I don't know, look, I think prediction markets are an extremely, extremely valuable and important product. I think they have a particular constituency that is maybe not as broad as people think. By the way, I think there also might be a backlash to sports betting too, a little bit, where people think that having like the minus 400 on every screen and things like that has gone like a little bit too far. But I'd say 80% that they're more widespread by a substantial amount, but only 20% that they've kind of like overtaken like the polls and more traditional horse race coverage.
All right, thank you. I am done torturing Nate. I'm happy to get questions from the audience. These don't have to be in the form of probabilities. They can be anything you want. Why don't you decide who gets the microphone?
Volume check. So, why weren't your online polls or your online models during your peak election coverage from, say, 2016 to 2020, why weren't they martingales? The old the Salem criticism.
So what do you mean? Like,
I'm pretty sure you never really disagreed with Talem's specific claim that if you were to bet money on your predictions on any given day, someone could arbitrage against those online models. Is that true?
Yeah, so I mean, the question is like, so why weren't they reflected in like prediction market odds or whatever? Or
like, why didn't you correct for the fact that you could bet against your future self under these models?
Oh no, I think that's just wrong. I mean, I think
okay.
Yeah, I disagree with Taleb. Yeah. I mean, Taleb actually, he used a version of the forecast called the nowcast, which is what you would predict today. It didn't actually understand what the forecast was saying. Like, he's a brilliant guy in some ways, but he's a fucking idiot in other ways, and he didn't bother to check his work.
Hey, so what's your probability that the U.S. survives a war with China if we have Trump seeing us through it?
I'll use my get out of jail free card on that one. I'm not a foreign policy expert.
Hi. So if I remember when you were at the New York Times, there was an issue that you couldn't bet or couldn't advertise betting, couldn't have any relationship to it. And I think you've been beholden to like large media corporations for a while. Now you're free. Are you doing lots of betting now?
I am not betting on politics, but I am doing some consulting for a financial company that's election related. So, between that and having a subscriber newsletter where we will eventually sell the model there beginning in a few weeks. Like I feel like I already feel like I have a lot more skin in the game, to use Taleb's phrase, which is good, by the way. It was very weird as someone who believes in incentives to have spent 10 years working for like one of the world's largest media corporations with like no incentive-based compensation whatsoever. And for the first 8.5 of those years, I worked really fucking hard despite that. And then last year and a half, I like kind of de facto quiet quit to write the book, but don't tell anyone that, fortunately, in public or anything like that. But yeah, no. So I feel like my incentives are aligned, but I'm not at this point making bets in the markets. And I would probably think that like me going in betting on Polymarket or something or Kalshi on the election, I mean, that would feel like a little bit weird, I think, still, since we could have like market moving influence. But yeah.
Hey, Nate, I'm curious how you think about risk. You've obviously just written a book about risk and all these different areas, whether it's gambling or hedge fund traders or AI. But there's a kind of risk that is more personal and harder to quantify. For instance, the risk of leaving a corporate job and starting a Substack. The risk of, moving to a new country, moving to a new city. All of these are risks. And in your personal life, do you operate where you actually try to like take major decisions like that, build a model around it, actually put some kind of numbers, or do you operate more on feel when it comes to those kind of things? Because that's a form of risk as well.
Look, I think in general, most people are probably too risk averse when it comes to that type of decision. Annie Duke, another former poker player, wrote a book called Quit that covers some of the evidence on this, where in general, people seem to be happier when they make a career change, make a lifestyle change, make a change of location in terms of where they're living, in their relationships and things like that. People are probably too risk averse from like years of evolutionary training of being in this kind of subsistence era where if you screw up, you might die, right? We have much more robustness and resilience now. I'm not someone who's like usually using like a spreadsheet to make personal decisions, but I do take my time with it. I mean, I've settled on a combination of things now, including the book and the newsletter and consulting, instead of jumping at the first opportunities I might have had. And it took a while. I mean, it took a while for me to kind of figure out what I thought the right opportunities were, and I'm pretty deliberate about the big decisions. I think sometimes people can think to death about some minor decision like where are they going to go to dinner, right? And then like big things like should I quit my job or what should I do with my life? They're kind of intuitive, and there's a role for intuition, but hopefully it's providing some approximation of a good answer.
In a Twitter thread a couple months ago, you said that you'll be talking about the effective altruism community in your book, and that you offer a substantial amount of critique of the community. And I'm curious if you could preview that a little bit.
Sure. I think there are a couple of... So some of my beef, I would say, is probably with certain kinds of utilitarianism. So in the middle of this kind of book about like gambling and risk, there's like a, 3,500 page critique of like kind of Peter Singer, basically, I think. So that's part of it. Part of the critique too is that the book deals with people who are very analytical. It's kind of, the book's really about people who are at the cross of being very analytical and very competitive, which describes poker players. It describes venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. It describes sports bettors. Describes like kind of a lot of the world, whereas EAs are very analytical, but not very competitive, at least in a monetary sense, which in some sense seems like really good. But in some sense, I think So one critique actually I have is that I think EA can be a little bit too trusting at times. That there is too much trust for people to be acting in good faith. I mean, I also talked a lot to SBF for the book, and maybe it's an inconveniently timed for EA, but I think that's a non-trivial critique. Look, I think EA sounds a little bit like what Tyler Cowen said. I think EA attracts like an extremely high ratio of very smart and intelligent people, and that means a lot. I think people's hearts really are in the right place for the most part, and that means a lot. I think EAs do a lot of kind of thankless work of being willing to be weird and say things that like are not mainstream, and I think that is extremely worthy and valuable. I probably err on the side of being warmer toward rationalism more broadly than kind of the EA brand more specifically. The book's pretty sympathetic to rationalism, to prediction markets, for example. It's trying to give a pretty honest and detailed history of all the figures in EA/rationalism and that distinction, including Scott and things like that. So I hope the book will be like scrupulously fair, right? And I would say too, the fact that kind of SBF is a big part of this world and he's in the middle of it. I mean, I tried not to overweight that too much, but that's a factor too in how the book wound up getting written.
Your views on prediction markets seem to have changed a bit over time, where you've always had a baseline respect for them, but then in 2020 you were kind of very dismissive about the predicted traders, and then that's gone back now. And for what it's worth, in 2020 their Breyer score was relatively good on the state things, and in 2022 you really beat them. So what are your thoughts on that journey?
I mean, for one thing, I think politics is somewhat unique in that, like, so if you look at like sports betting, it kind of forms a U-shaped curve in terms of how beatable are the markets, right? If you're an expert on like Mongolian table tennis, you can definitely beat the betting markets for Mongolian table tennis. The problem is they'll cut you off from betting more than $5 a match the minute they realize that you're any good, right? On the other end of the tail, or the U, as I call it, is something like the Super Bowl, where there is like so much public money that there's like not actually enough like sharp money to absorb it all. So the Super Bowl, you can have plus CV bets by kind of fading the public sometimes, right? Figure out what average Joe is doing, bet the opposite side. You might actually have, after the House rake, you might actually have like a slightly plus EV bet. Presidential elections have historically been on the extreme end of that U, where lots of people have opinions about the election. There has not been a large class of professional forecasters of elections. I think that is changing to some degree. I mean, now that I was a free agent, I was able to talk to different financial concerns and hedge funds and things like that. And clearly, like, without disclosing names, like clearly there are multiple firms that are now like taking election forecasting very seriously. But I think kind of in the circa 2016, 2020 world, then you had a lot of dumb money in those markets in ways that make prediction markets make politics like not the best example for prediction markets, right? Because they're so public and because there's not this kind of group of experts that specialize in it very much, apart from like a handful of people, then it's more the exception than the rule, I think. But I think it's going to probably change, at least based on the conversations I've had with much more investment in as kind of everything gets swallowed by politics. I mean, I think financial firms feel like we have to forecast politics well to forecast financial markets well. So I think that's in the process of evolving.
You've obviously done a lot on forecasting, but you've also done a lot on explaining forecasting to very wide audiences. And I'm curious, like, what you've learned about that over the last 10 years and how kind of optimistic or pessimistic you are about that at this point.
I mean, in some sense, kind of my more recent moves reflect a certain sort of pessimism, I guess, where it's like I want to try to talk to a narrower audience that understands it more, maybe is willing to pay for things that are behind a paywall, for parts of the analysis and things like that, as opposed to trying to talk to a really wide audience. Look, I think it's something of a misnomer that, people just don't understand probabilities. I think when people like go to their doctor and their doctor says there's a 30% chance of a cancer reoccurrence if you do this, but 20% if you change your lifestyle in these ways, I think people have a pretty good intuitive grasp of what that means, right? If you say there's a 20% chance of rain, they may or may not carry an umbrella, but they kind of understand what that means. I think it's more that kind of people's brains are kind of quote unquote poisoned by political partisanship, and that affects it more than the numbers. But the typical audience for politics coverage is quite partisan, and like that's not the audience I want. And I'm not sure, to the earlier point about kind of just as I don't know that presidential elections are the best way to teach people about prediction markets, I'm not sure they're the best example for forecasting either. I think people tend to see elections as like their own special, unique snowflakes and not drawn from some larger probability distribution of outcomes. So sports is probably much better by comparison. I think sports fans intuit there's some degree of randomness in the outcome. Whereas with politics, I'm not waving the white flag, but I'm trying to be more selective in how I engage and trying to very deliberately kind of steer away from being like the election forecast guy.
How many more questions do you have in you?
Yeah, Scott, this is fucking Scott Alexander. He needs some questions too, people.
I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, not at all for Scott, sorry. There's tens of dollars of fake money riding on this question. So
okay.
Have you made a Manifold account? Have you placed a bet? And have you created a market?
No. Sure. I mean, I love Manifold. Yeah. Okay.
I remember thinking that you were the only sane public figure in the world when Johnson & Johnson paused its vaccine on account of 1 death in 7 million cases.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you intend to write more about public health and the FDA specifically, and any ideas that we might have to stop it from being so terrible.
Probably. I kind of wonder if I had my Substack during kind of the peak of the pandemic, I wonder how audience captured it would have gotten by COVID stuff. No, look, I mean, COVID is one of those topics on which I think I'm actually, in public health, I'm kind of like punting on until the election's over a little bit. Even the very kind of long, like, root claim stuff I've kind of only browsed through, even though it's a debate I'm very, very interested in. But yeah, I might get back to it at some point, but I have to triage some stuff. And like, you know, when you're kind of on the newsletter beat, you learn a lot of tricks for like, what can I actually write a good post in 3 hours versus what's going to kind of creep into like 3 days. And the public health stuff, I think you want to get all the details right. And so that's probably more of a post-November project.
In election modeling, what have you found is the best way to deal with circular covariates, like the polls affect the fundraising and the fundraising affects the polls reciprocally?
So with the presidential model is actually very simple, right? It's just the polls and an economic index. I guess in principle, it could be some feedback in the stock market because the stock market can reflect election expectations. It's one of the variables in the 6-variable economic index. If you saw the previous panel with David Shore and Kate Hall on political forecasting, this is more of an issue when it comes to the congressional model, where traditionally the 538 model used expert ratings from groups like the Cook Political Report. But the expert raters actually look at like what the 538 model says, so it becomes very circular very quickly. We probably will not have a congressional model at Silver Bulletin in 2024, but for 2026, hopefully that'll be restored. I'll probably just remove that component, right? It was a little bit of a cheat anyway, I think, to like, I'd rather have a model that like is purely quote unquote quantitative and objective, and then you make your kind of subjective corrections after that, than this kind of mushy middle uncanny valley in between, if that makes sense, right? And I think kind of incorporating the expert ratings, apart from this regurgitation problem, suffered from that kind of uncanny valley effect a little bit too, where it was like kind of subjective, but in a way that got a little bit weird.
The second question from now we will take for Scott Alexander.
Oh, I don't know. I have a question for Nate.
That's the first question.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, feel free to not answer this if you don't want to, but in your personal investments, are you long AI?
Me?
For me or Nate?
This was for Nate.
I have a fair amount of NVIDIA, so I guess yes.
Okay, so my question is for actually both of you. So Scott Alexander, one of the questions you asked Nate is about the conditional probabilities. So regarding conditional markets, if you could magically wave your hand and create one conditional market that is very liquid and gives a lot of information, what conditional market would you like to see in the world that doesn't exist today?
Tough question. So I think I would really like to know more about AI strategy. And the market about AI strategy that comes to mind first is something like, suppose everybody who was interested in AI risk completely abandoned working with any companies whatsoever, said that AI companies were the devil, treated them the same way that global warming activists treat fossil fuel companies. What would AI risk be then compared to if those same AI activists did some kind of middle way policy where they continued to cooperate with those companies? Is a question that I'm thinking about a lot. Would I necessarily trust prediction markets to have a good opinion on that? I guess it depends what we mean by very liquid.
I'd like to see some markets, and maybe there are, maybe haven't spent enough time looking around, but more markets on kind of what the risks of a Trump presidency are. You'll hear Democrats say things like, if Trump gets elected, this is the last election we'll ever have, right? Which I think is a low tail risk probability. At the same time, like January 6th was a very serious event, and that in some ways suffers from the problem of like, it was ultimately a near miss, and people probably don't learn enough from near misses. But I like the kind of people who use that rhetoric to quantify it, both as kind of like a challenge to like, okay, do you really mean that? Or are you kind of using rhetoric to try to rile people up? But also to say like, what scenario should people be relatively more or less concerned about, right? In 2020, a lot of the concern was, the courts will step in and stop the vote count, right? Which is not what they did. The courts didn't really play ball at all with GOP shenanigans. However, you had Trump kind of launch a physical insurrection against the Capitol, and that wasn't on people's bingo card. But like, I think for like threat modeling, and I think that would be valuable for a variety of reasons.
This question is for Nate. I'm over here. How do you feel like your work has changed the political economy of DC specifically? Or, I feel like, you arrived on the scene, it made a lot of waves, and there's a lot of money in politics. And so how do you feel like, your work has altered that world and helped shape it?
I mean, I really don't know that world that well, right? Like, I don't have a lot of friends in like politics. I like people in this community. I like people in poker a whole lot and sports and things like that. I've always been like a little bit of a square peg in politics, and I live in New York and not DC. I mean, in the kind of narrow market for like election forecasting, I think it's been filled in somewhat cynical ways, right? There's kind of always going to be like a market for like the guy who always has good news for Democrats, right? Like that's a role that's filled, and then like, you keep doubling down every time till Democrats have a bad election, then you get your head chopped off, some other guy pops up to replace you, that kind of thing. Look, I mean, certainly I think like the news media has gotten more sophisticated with election coverage. People have lots of complaints about the New York Times and the Washington Post and things like that. But if you go and like read like Times political coverage from like the 1980s, it's like fairy tales, right? They just make shit up. They just make up narratives whole cloth based on the prerogative of the author. And now they're, I think, a lot more grounded in reality, and that's improved. But I wouldn't say there's not enough polling being cited, right? I'm not kind of one of those scolding people who's like, oh, there's too much horse race coverage, but like there's probably enough. I mean, this year we've had the general election matchup locked in for a long time, and you've had like page A1 polling stories like a year in advance of the election. Like that's probably overcorrecting a bit, I'd say, but still, I think news coverage has been net improved, and I don't know about like how campaigns are run. I think the Biden campaign seems to be in a little bit of denial about the polling, but for news coverage, it's improved for sure.
Yeah, my question is mostly for Scott, but appreciate your take, Nate, as well. And it relates to the previous panel discussion, basically. My version of what has been discussed, partly at least, there is something like, we have been focusing a lot on like probabilistic answers, or is it like to measure forecasting outputs? And maybe if we now focus more on the rationale or like the reasoning behind this, it might help to, I know, sell forecasting more, or the prediction markets can take over the world finally. So yeah, I was curious, Scott, what you think about this, if that's something that you think would really help, or you also see as a missing piece, or if you think it's a major contribution to why prediction markets haven't taken over the world.
I think it depends on the application. I think if we're talking about, let's say, me writing a blog post, for example, I recently wrote a blog post on, I'm going to forget the exact number, but California bill on regulating AI. And it seemed like an obvious thing you would want in that blog post is this bill actually going to pass? And this was something that I didn't know. Probably there are like some lobbyists in Sacramento who have a pretty good idea, but they're not telling. And so I went to the manifold prediction market, and it had that. I don't think having rationale would have helped at all for that. Like, we know the reasons the bill might pass, we know the reasons the bill might not pass, and it's kind of just a question of which side is more powerful, what do people think? And I think there are thousands of questions like that where you use the prediction market kind of as a way to get acquainted with a subject where otherwise you would just have no idea about something very important. I think I didn't get most of the last panel, but I think what many of them were saying is that if you're trying to convince a decision maker like a CEO to use a prediction market in their planning, then they want to know why it says what it says. And I think that's extremely reasonable, and I think it's great that both people and AIs are working on that problem.
Hi. Here. This is a politics question, but definitely for both of you. If you look at the polymarket or manifold graph of Trump winning the primary over the last year or so, it basically looks like a straight line up from initially contested with DeSantis to he was going to win, which is not impossible, but it's sort of a weird thing for a probability graph to look like. It's tricky with benefit of hindsight, but do you think this was a fair estimate at all times of the probability, or was the market sort of too slow to realize that Trump was going to win?
I had bet money on Trump in 2021 or something, so I think it was too slow. I think it's often reasonable to have a straight line graph if, let's say, Donald Trump just often does insane things, and I think maybe in 2021 what you were thinking was something like, well, Trump seems beloved by the Republicans, he's the natural choice, but he's always doing these insane things and getting convicted of crimes. As time goes on, maybe one of them will finally alienate people. And it seems like instead, with every passing month, we've learned that no, Trump's various insane crimes have not passed whatever hypothetical bar we thought might have existed, where that will kind of knock him down and leave a place for DeSantis or someone to come through. So I think people were generally a fixed 10% or something too low, but I also think that the general shape of the graph isn't that unreasonable. I'd like to hear Nate on this also.
No, look, if you had a market on what are the odds that Nate gets hit by a bus by August 10th, 2024 or something, that would be more or less a straight line chart, right? In an NBA game, when an NBA team is favored and they just kind of maintain their favorite, then they go from 80% favorite to 100% favorite. I do think, like Scott said, I thought the market was low on Trump in general, especially from late spring onward, when kind of the DeSantis campaign began to clearly fail. I mean, at some point it was actually pretty close in the polls, and then DeSantis wasn't a product that was selling, and that became self-evident pretty quickly. And at that point, I think Trump should have been a much heavier favorite than he was.
Hey, I have a question just for Scott. It's a two-part question. Part one, I think the fire is out, so I feel robbed. Part two...
We are both spatially and temporally by the side of the fire.
All right. Part two, you've written a lot about predictive processing as a way of understanding the human brain, minimizing predictive error. That's sort of like manifold, right? Anyway, I'm interested in whether AI is going to kill everyone. And recently, some people have like started thinking, hey, can we just think of minimizing predictive error as the source of agency? Can we use that frame to think about AI? So I want to check that it's like actually real, that that's like actually what's happening with humans. What are like the open frontiers in just figuring out, is this actually what's happening in the human brain?
That is a great question where I don't think I have enough of a neuroscience background to understand. I don't think we know at the level of population. Like, we have things like the nucleus accumbens, where we're able to see that the reward signal pretty closely tracks something that could be predictive error. I think we know less about how cognitive schemas are formed. We know less about kind of how you go from predictive error in dealing with cats to a strong model of cats. And I don't think you have the same kind of like clear, this neuron's signal is monitoring the prediction error in something that we have for reward signal. So I cannot really tell you a great answer to that. And I would recommend just kind of reading Friston and neuroscience papers and seeing if they know anything about that.
What topic would each of you like to have the other think really hard about and write a thoughtful post on?
I mean, I'll kind of repeat the same. I would love Scott to weigh in on the Trump threat to democracy stuff. As someone who I think would come at it from kind of a fresh perspective, and someone who is not particularly partisan or maybe Gray Tribe partisan or whatever, I would love to see that post.
I'm very happy with Nate's most recent book. I enjoy seeing him think about AI, and I also think that him thinking about AI lends it a lot of credibility that will make it get taken more seriously in the halls of power. So I'm delighted to see him working on that.
Hey, right over here. This question is for Nate. There's actually two parts. One is, after a brief plateau, polling response rates are dropping again, basically to an all-time low. What are your thoughts on that? How are you going to basically deal with that? The other question is the narrative that young people are basically turning against Biden over Palestine, do you see any evidence for that actually being true?
Yeah, so on the first question, I mean, look, this is one of many reasons why I'm explicitly transitioning out of politics, right? I mean, the book is not all about politics and like it's kind of, well, it is about politics. It's, everything's about politics. But it's not about like elections per se. Look, in the long run, if you're getting fewer and fewer people to respond to your polls and the sample is less and less represented, that kind of has to be a problem. I think pollsters figured out maybe before 2022, which is a pretty good year for polling, that they have to like polls now are basically more like models than like poll flavored inputs than like pure public opinion surveys any longer. But yeah, it's a problem. We just had like, very wrong polling in India, although India, the polling has always been very wrong, so it was nothing new, for example. But yeah, to have a continued secular decline in the accuracy of polling seems like a fairly good prior to me. As far as Israel-Palestine, I mean, I think it is an issue where Biden is hurt no matter what he says or does a little bit. It's also maybe the issue that most over-indexes for concern among kind of college-educated elites, quote-unquote, as compared to regular voters, right? If you look kind of like have Gallup say, what's the most important problem facing the electorate today, then 1% of people might mention Israel, Palestine, Gaza, whereas the New York Times might occupy 20% of headline space and things like that. It causes problems for Biden in Michigan, for example, which has a substantial Arab American, Palestinian American population. Michigan's usually a little bit bluer than Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but like even a 1 or 2 point swing, it's like 2% of the population could be material there potentially. But on my list of concerns for Biden, it would be like not higher than like 5th or 6th after age and higher prices and maybe frankly, general backlash to left where shifts in cultural areas and things like that, and immigration's a problem for Biden, and then maybe fifth, and like, but he, it's not helpful to him, but yeah.
It's time for 3 more questions.
This question is for Scott. You have written a lot about problems in academia, and you read a lot of papers. What are your heuristics for separating good science from bad science when you're like reading through papers and trying to get to like ground truths?
Yeah, so it's very hard. There are approximately 2 sources of information. One is, do you actually understand the paper and what it's talking about? The other is the buzz around the paper, the credentials of the author, all of this indirect data that we try not to use because it's contaminated, but sometimes you have to use. I think partly you use the buzz to determine how closely to read the paper. Nobody can read every paper closely, but you want to see which ones are controversial or which ones seem like the kind of thing that might be biased. And then you maybe just try to rely on your knowledge of statistics or talk to someone else. I have found that it is very useful to talk to people in a field, not just because they have the actual knowledge, but because there are whole fields where people will be like, oh yeah, that's by Smith and Jones. Everyone knows that all of their papers are wrong. Like, nobody told the rest of us this. They're like, yeah, well, interfield politics, it's complicated. Or they'll be like, yeah, everybody knows that they had to publish that one paper because their department needed to do something to cooperate with that journal editor, but they don't really take it seriously and nobody cares. So it's very useful to be able to get that kind of academic inside view. And otherwise, it's just kind of a question of how much do you know and how closely are you going to read the paper. And also, just checking a lot of different sources. There are many papers that are great on their own, and then if you look on Google Scholar, even just in the like work cited by this paper, work cited in this paper, you find 20 other papers, 10 of them agree with it, 10 of them disagree with it, and then you're like, I'm not going to solve this personally right now. Or you're going to look at all 10 papers and see what they find differently. So I think it's very important to never trust a single paper, and once you read the whole structure of people citing other people and so on, you kind of get a 80-20 of being in the field and knowing who's doing what and why.
Scott, this is a question for you. So private equity is really excited to replace doctors with anything faster and cheaper, and insurance companies really love algorithmic medicine in terms of reimbursements. And I'm wondering, given that, what you think the role AI will play in real-time clinical decision making, maybe over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, so you may know more about this than I do. My perspective is AIs now are often quite good at certain kinds of medicine. Even like an off-the-shelf LLM, you can give it a medical case, and often, I mean, it may not give you the exact right diagnosis, but if you ask for 5 diagnoses, it may give you some that you didn't consider before. Or if you ask it for 5 different courses of action, you may realize, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So it's pretty good. I'm sure that if somebody were working on a medical AI with the same level of dedication that, let's say, Perplexity is working on a search AI or Future Search is working on a forecasting AI, they could make that even better. You're not going to replace doctors for purely regulatory reasons. Nobody is going to trust their care to an AI. No medical regulator is going to let them do that, and no pharmacy is going to accept prescriptions written by an AI. So one possibility is that you get a doctor who's like using an EMR that's plugged into an AI, and just as EMRs now pop up 1,000 useless pop-ups saying like, hey, I see this as an old person, have you asked them about falls, or something like that, instead of just like reading their age off of the age box, it will be like, hey, I see that the whole clinical picture of this case suggests that there's somebody who's vulnerable to this thing. Do you want to consider that? In theory, you could have that streamline doctors and let one doctor see more patients. In practice, they've already streamlined doctors to the point where they spend 5 minutes per patient, and I don't know how you would streamline it any further. So I think the future is probably AI-enabled EMRs. I don't think it has any real effect on the world in terms of fewer doctors or faster care. And there may be people here who know much more about this than I do.
This next one is our final question, but our speakers can opt into holding office hours to your right at the pagoda.
That's a question for both of you. What do you think the probability of a war over AI supremacy occurs either if Biden is elected or Trump is elected? What's the probability in each circumstance?
I mean, I'm not sure that A, I've thought that much about whether I think Biden or Trump is better for AI, or B, I've kind of thought about this enough to put a probability on it. I do think in general that if you think that AI is going to be extremely disruptive, then wars or substantial reshaping of the political environment is possible, if not likely, right? So in the book, I kind of I don't want to put a number, but not zero, not tiny, right? I mean, in the book, I think we should my thing is, I think we should think about how seismic or disruptive we expect AI to be first, and then kind of maybe flow into a P-doom probability from there, right? If you think AI is the most important technological invention since the dawn of humankind, right, then that's going to disrupt everything, obviously, right? Maybe war is just one of many concerns that we have. If you think it's just kind of it's kind of like the automobile or something, probably you wouldn't go to war over the Model T or something. So that's how I kind of vaguely think about it.
Well, this is a really complex question. So you got to sort it out into, we are in the middle of an intelligence explosion, a singularity, versus everything else. I don't want to predict what happens during a singularity. I do think wars are generally unlikely. A war between two great powers has a big chance of turning nuclear. It has a big chance of just devastating everybody. My impression is that usually when large wars happen nowadays, with the exception of maybe Ukraine, it's often everybody was trying to do brinksmanship and made a mistake. I can imagine that happening with Taiwan, especially if people care a lot about Taiwan's microchips. But in general, I don't think that AI necessarily changes things that much. Either people are not far ahead in AI, in which case they just want to compete normally rather than have a war, or somebody is far ahead in AI and it seems important, in which case they will win the war and the other person won't want to start it. So I think you need a pretty complicated, very small middle ground between those places before you get a war. And my impression is that great powers have been pretty good at avoiding war since World War II. I know that Taleb says this is kind of over-updating on a small amount of data, and I respect that. But I would not expect that Xi Jinping wakes up one morning and thinks, let's have a war about AI. I think that's not really how great powers work these days. Well, okay, so that's the other half of your question. And I actually don't know how to calculate that. I've heard people say that because Trump is such a weird guy, you can't do brinksmanship with him, so you mostly just back down. This seems to be kind of how he did okay versus Iran. So I don't think of him as the kind of person who would start a war for no reason. I think he would do kind of stupid brinksmanship stuff for no reason, but given the fact that he's such a bad guy to do brinksmanship stuff against, I don't know if that would go better or worse than if Biden does it. So I have no strong opinion there.
No, book comes out, On the Edge. The Art of Risking Everything comes out August 13th at your favorite retailer.
I will be reviewing Nate Silver's book sometime after August 13th. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you so much, everybody.